All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this special session where we discuss the historic MEV-1 mission and what it means for the future of commercial satellite servicing industry. My name is Brian Whedon from the Secure World Foundation, and in the context of this discussion, I'm also the Executive Director of the Consortium for the Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, or CONFERS, which is an international group of companies developing standards for commercial satellite servicing. Today, we're going to talk about the Mission Extension Vehicle, which is the commercial industry's first satellite life extension vehicle, designed to dock with a satellite whose fuel is nearly depleted. Once connected, MEV uses its own thrusters and fuel supply to extend the satellite's lifetime. MEV can then undock and go off and service additional satellites. On February 25th, the MEV-1 completed its first ever docking of 2 satellites in geosynchronous orbit, and is currently providing life extension services for the Intelsat 901 satellite. Today with me to discuss this mission and what it means is Joe Anderson, Vice President of Space Logistics LLC, a Northrop Grumman company, who played an instrumental role in the MEV-1 program and the first mission. We're going to have a discussion about where we got here, or how we got here, and where we're going next for about the next 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to be turning to audience questions. We're going to ask you to submit your questions through the Slido application, which you can access by using, let me go 2 more slides, please. Which you can access using slido.com and put in the code IAC 2020. So if you want to get a jump on asking any questions, you can do so now. We'll get to those in a bit. So, Joe, turning to you. Welcome.
Yes. Hi, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to share our story about the first commercial docking in GEO orbit and the first commercial satellite servicing mission. Before we get started, though, I think it's really important for me to reemphasize that Space Logistics is a wholly owned subsidiary of Northrop Grumman. But make no mistake about it, it's all made possible by the outstanding women and men of Northrop Grumman that have designed, built, tested, and are operating our systems that make it possible.
Well, that's great. Absolutely. So why don't we get into the details here? Can you start by just talking a bit about where the idea for this mission concept came from?
Sure. So the idea for satellite life extension and servicing really goes back decades. Our civil agencies have done technology demonstrations, and there have been others that have tried to start this type of business before us, but they have failed to get off the ground until now. The basis of this idea stems from the fact that many satellites, especially in GEO orbit, are replaced with new satellites and then decommissioned simply because they've run out of fuel. All the systems and payloads on the satellite are typically working fine, but due to the unique properties of GEO orbit, the final drops of fuel must be used to raise the orbit to what we affectionately call the GEO graveyard orbit before turning off the satellite. The hypothesis for our new business is that a cost-effective, reliable, and safe method for extending the station-keeping lives of these satellites would make existing operators more cost-effective, plus break down barriers to entry to help grow the market for new and existing operators alike. And then looking beyond this immediate business opportunity, servicing would usher in a new wave of in-space capabilities, further expanding the commercial opportunity and helping to overcome the tyranny of launch. Space Logistics and Northrop Grumman's story itself starts in the early 2000s at ATK Space Systems before we were acquired by Northrop Grumman. Tom Wilson, the general manager of ATK Space Systems and the current president of Space Logistics, identified a strategic opening by combining the expertise we had gained in developing tools for the Hubble servicing missions with our spacecraft manufacturing business to secure a leadership position in the market for satellite servicing. The first step in 2009 was establishing a laboratory to develop our rendezvous proximity operations and docking capabilities. This led to be extremely valuable in demonstrating to customers, regulators, and underwriters that the idea of docking to another satellite in GEO and extending its life was not that big of a technological leap. This lab was also critical to testing prototype docking systems and acceptance testing our flight hardware and software. In parallel with this lab's development effort from about 2009 to 2015, we refined the technical concept and the business model through hundreds of customer regulator and insurance and finance company meetings.
So I have to say, what was it like having to convince your company to invest in not only just the new technology, but applying that technology to a whole new and, as at that time, yet unproven market?
Yeah. Well, over those 5 to 6 years of the concept and business development, we faced a typical innovator's dilemma. Each year I would meet with our customers and ask them, if a service were available in orbit today, would you pay for it? And the answer for many of these operators was, yes, I have a need today, but I'm not sure that I have a need 3 years from now when you would get to orbit. Then I would call on those same operators a year later, and I get the same answer, but this time for a different satellite. And that would happen year after year after year. On top of that was layered the issue that customers didn't want to contract with us unless we were financed. And the financiers didn't want to discuss financing if we didn't have firm contracts. In U.S. vernacular, it truly felt to me like a field of dreams in which, if you build it, they will come. A real turning point, though, occurred in 2016, just after ATK and Orbital Sciences merged. The merger of these two companies helped bring together the right mix of the business model and the technical heritage for this business. I recall briefing MEV to Dave Thompson. He's the founder of Orbital Sciences Corp. and CEO of Orbital ATK at the time. He's a real innovator in our industry. After that briefing, I was walking down the hall behind Dave and Blake Larson, who is our current president of Northrop Grumman Space Systems. Dave's comment to Blake as we were walking down the hallway was something like, well, innovation is in our tagline. I think we need to find a way to do this. And they did. In the spring of 2016, Tom, Blake, and Dave convinced Orbital ATK board to invest in the development and launch of the first MEV. And weeks later, we signed our first contract for MEV services with Intelsat.
So you finally got your leadership on and the company on board. What other kinds of hurdles did you have within the broader space industry?
Really good question. Yeah, we absolutely had other hurdles. Besides the technical challenge of developing the world's first ever vehicle to service satellites in orbit that were not designed to be serviced, we did have to pave new roads through both the regulatory and the insurance worlds. In the US, we have different regulatory agencies that are assigned to licensing launch services, commercial communication satellites, and commercial Earth imaging satellites. Then here we come with a commercial geosatellite servicing vehicle. Where does that go? It simply didn't fit the licensing structure that the US government had established. However, we did find great support from all of the involved agencies within the US government. We worked with the US Department of State, the Department of Commerce, the FAA, FCC, and NOAA to identify the best approach to license our unique capabilities and enable this new space enterprise. Ultimately, we landed on a solution in which the FCC licensed our communications and acts as our primary oversight agency with regards to the Outer Space Treaty. And we also have a NOAA license for the operation of our remote sensing cameras. I think insurance is another first of its kind also. Space insurers are very familiar with underwriting risks for commercial communication satellites and commercial imaging satellites. They're pretty standard formulations to calculate losses for these types of assets if they were to experience a partial failure in orbit. But our MEV doesn't fit any of those prior models. And so we had to develop all new approaches to loss formulation for this new capability. And I really want to give a lot of credit to these communities of regulators and underwriters for being innovative right alongside us and enabling this new commercial industry to flourish.
So let's shift a bit now and talk a bit more about the design of the MEV and some of the underlying technology. Can you talk about what makes the vehicle unique, what aspects were kind of from heritage, and what aspects were sort of new?
Sure. So how did we come up with the design? The honest and simple answer to that is a lot of really bright engineers. And they were guided by one really important strategy. And that strategy was to keep it simple and build off as much heritage as possible. Honestly, I think it was this strategy coupled with the good fortune of our mergers that brought critical heritage that really has helped make us successful. You see, the MEV is built on a standard Northrop Grumman GeoStar spacecraft, of which we've launched about 40 to date. Traditionally, these spacecraft have carried communication payloads. As a BD guy, I like to say that for MEV, we removed that communication payload and we replaced it with a rendezvous and docking system. I'm sure our engineers would not say it was that simple, but in the big picture of things, this is really what we did. So this really provided significant heritage to our spacecraft bus. For rendezvous, we extensively used systems, processes, and lessons learned from the Northrop Grumman Cygnus program. The Cygnus program delivers cargo to the International Space Station. So this provided significant heritage to the key rendezvous operations with relatively small incremental technology developments there. Probably the biggest technology development was in the docking systems. And if we could go to the next slide for that. So here we did have to design a system that would be compatible with a large percentage of existing satellites in GEO. For this, our engineers identified that approximately 80% of all GEO satellites have two common features that can be utilized to establish a secure docking. These features are the launch adapter ring and the liquid Apogee engine. You can see these features in the image here. The client vehicle is on the right, and the MEV is holding its position in the capture box on the left. On the aft end of the client satellite, you can see the liquid Apogee engine cone and the launch adapter ring that surrounds it. Honestly, it looks like a target that was designed for this purpose. The liquid Apogee engine acts as a cone to capture to guide a probe, which once it passes through the throat of the engine, it expands to capture the client satellite. The probe is then retracted, pulling 3 stanchions or feet up against the launch adapter ring, securely clamping the two vehicles together. This provides a rather simple and elegant solution that enables the MEV to be compatible with most existing GEO satellites.
So can you talk a bit more in detail about what the MEV mission looked like, including this docking and clamping?
Oh, sure, certainly. So for our MEV-1, it launched on October 9th of last year as one of 2 Northrop Grumman satellites that were stacked on top of a Proton rocket. The rocket gave us a perfect ride to geosynchronous transfer orbit, after which MEV separated from the rocket and began its slow electric propulsion orbit raising at GEO. As we were raising the orbit out to GEO, in about the December timeframe, Intelsat took their 901 satellite out of service and began raising it out to the GEO graveyard, which is about 300 kilometers above GEO. As this was the first rendezvous and docking of our MEV, both Intelsat and Space Logistics determined to perform this initial docking in the relative safety of the graveyard orbit, just in case something did not work as expected. In early February, the 2 satellites arrived simultaneously in the graveyard orbit, drifting slowly westward across the Pacific Ocean. The MEV performed a series of far rendezvous maneuvers to co-locate itself with the 901. On February 25th of this year, the near rendezvous, approach, and docking were performed. We have a short video here that illustrates this segment of the mission.
This video starts with the MEV-1 already co-located with the IS-901 satellite in the GEO graveyard orbit, drifting westward across the Pacific Ocean. Soon you will see the MEV passing by the west side of the IS-901. You can see actual images from our infrared camera in the upper right. These images were taken from about 120 meters away as we circumnavigate to the first waypoint at which the MEV-1 stops and waits for ground command to approach. This waypoint is called the far hold and is about 80 meters behind the client satellite. Our ground controllers send the command for the MEV to proceed on to the next waypoint called the near hold, which is about 20 meters behind the IS-901. As the MEV-1 approaches the near hold, it slowly stops and once again waits for ground to provide permission to continue to the next waypoint, the capture box, which is about 1 meter behind the IS-901. Here you will start to make out the key docking interfaces that enable the MEV to capture and dock with the IS-901. These interfaces are the liquid Apogee engine and the launch adapter ring, which are both conveniently located on the back of most GEO satellites. The MEV uses a capture mechanism to extend from the MEV into the liquid Apogee engine, expanding just beyond the throat to capture it. The capture mechanism is then retracted, pulling 3 stanchions up tight against the IS-901 launch adapter ring, securely clamping the 2 spacecraft together.
So following the docking, we relocated the combined vehicle stack to their new operating position over the Atlantic Ocean region. Along the way, the MEV removed about 1.5 degrees of inclination that the IS-901 had accumulated prior to docking. And today, the MEV continues to provide IS-901 with the life extension services and will continue to do so until 2025, when it will return IS-901 to the geograveyard orbit and undock. The MEV will then move on to its next customer.
So I think that must have been a pretty amazing feeling watching all this happen in real time after all this years of effort and planning. So can you talk a bit about what that meant for you and your team?
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing is a great way to describe it, Brian. You know, Northrop Grumman and the Intelsat team of engineers and operators performed with such professionalism, cooperation, and dedication to detail. No doubt there were trials and tribulations along the way, but the team overcame each of them to execute a flawless docking in the end. I remember sitting in the management room next to my customer and 30-year colleague, Jean-Luc Frolinger from Intelsat. And you know, Brian, he and I worked together actually on the Intelsat 901 when it was launched. Jean-Luc was one of the last people on Earth to see the 901 at the launch facility, while I was working in the control center where we took over the operation of the 901 after it separated from the launch vehicle. And now here we both are watching these images come down in real time from the MEV, seeing it again for the first time in 19 years. It was an emotional moment as we listened to the operations team calling out the automated docking sequence as it executed step by step, just as I had told the story 1,000 times before to customers, regulators, insurers, and others. It was really awe-inspiring, and I think it was truly a career highlight for everyone involved. I know it was for me. So you know, to do something like this that had never been done before and know that you are pioneering an entirely new industry in space, I don't think I've stopped smiling since that day, Brian.
I can understand that. So let's look big picture. What does this mean for the commercial satellite servicing industry? Do you see this as the start of something bigger?
Yeah, absolutely. I see this as a real turning point. One colleague of mine has said that we have now entered space 2.0. I think there will be a time when satellite industry history will be discussed as a time before there was in-orbit satellite servicing and the time after satellite servicing. And I think that this event marks that milestone. As for space logistics, we continue to have great support from our leadership all the way up to Kathy Warden, the Northrop Grumman CEO. She is also a big fan of this innovation. In fact, in addition to launching our MEV2 on August 15th of this year, we have already begun development of our next generation satellite servicing and life extension systems. These systems are called our Mission Robotic Vehicle and our Mission Extension Pods. In February of this year, we announced a partnership with DARPA, who will be providing the robotics technology that will fly on our Mission Robotic Vehicle through a program they call RSGS. The image here illustrates this system. Shown here is a Mission Robotic Vehicle on the left using one of its 2 robotic arms to install a Mission Extension Pod onto a client satellite. This small electric propulsion pod can extend the station-keeping life of a typical GEO satellite for 6 years. In addition to installing pods, the Mission Robotic Vehicle will be able to perform detailed robotic inspections, basic repairs, as well as relocate client satellites that might not be compatible with our MEV. So
let's talk a bit about confers. Since this, we'll talk about this for a second, and then we're going to turn to the audience questions in a second. But let's finish up with a brief touch about confers. Space Logistics is one of the founding members of confers, this consortium that we started a few years ago to help advance servicing and role of standards. I'll just ask you, what value do you guys see in confers, and how do you think it's evolved for the last couple of years?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. Honestly, at first, we were a bit skeptical about the value of establishing this consortium, but I think it is truly proving to be a pivotal and valuable asset to the industry, in large part thanks to your leadership, Brian, as the executive director. For us, Confers has really 2 key values. First, as a new and emerging commercial space industry, we are having to overcome a lack of established and coordinated regulatory frameworks internationally. Confers has provided a tremendous platform from which our industry has been able to communicate our operating principles and practices to this international regulatory agencies. The principles and practices all stem from the basics of our services being cooperative, responsible, and transparent. The second value is in establishing technical standards. Through our technical and lexicon working groups, we have laid the framework for clearly articulating and communicating our products, services, and operations, and we are establishing best practices to ensure safety of operations. Next, we hope to begin developing technical interface standards that will help grow the market for in-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing.
And definitely hope that that can happen. And I'll just say that, you know, a lot of those things that Converse has done, you've been able to do without the participation of your company and all the members, because that's who actually has a lot of the technical expertise in all this. So thank you for that, Joe, for that overview. We're going to turn now to the questions. And the top rated question out there is, how many different vehicles could MEV theoretically service, and what happens to it at its end of life? Are you going to have another servicing vehicle to tow it out of orbit, or is it going to be able to do it itself?
Right. So I think, as I mentioned, the MEV is a multi-use vehicle. So it is a 15-year design life, as typical geocom satellites are, but it has significantly more fuel available than 15 years of life extension. So we could remain docked to, you know, satellites and extend their life in geo for 15 years. Plus, in addition to that, we could do a number of degrees of inclination reduction. So one of the services we foresee doing is, like we did with 901, dock to satellites in inclined orbit and reduce those inclinations, which burns up additional fuel. So the satellite the MEV was designed to do, 15 to 20 or more docking missions.
And I think you mentioned that the next generation system you're envisioning would be able to put the smaller little pods. Is that a little bit different approach than the bigger MEV?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a different approach. We were trying to find a way to meet the fundamental economics of potentially doing refueling, which we do foresee in the future, doing refueling once satellites are prepared for refueling. But to try to achieve those types of economics in the near term. And so our engineers looked at that problem, and they came up with a new approach using these relatively small mission extension pods. It's a small electric propulsion augmentation device, about the size of a 2-drawer filing cabinet. And we can launch many of those over time. And the MEV, or the mission robotic vehicle, can retrieve those mission extension pods out of orbit and then install them onto our clients. So it's a little bit of a smaller device. It only does orbit control. It does not do attitude control of the combined vehicle stack as an MEV does.
So I'm going to combine a couple of different questions here that are all related to the docking, the rendezvous and prox ops. So the question is essentially, what technologies you use for that? How did you navigate it using GNSS, like GPS at all? What sort of sensors were actually used for the approach and the docking?
Right. So for the co-location is very standard. That's performed in most geo satellites that co-locate inside the same station keeping box. But once we start getting closer, within a couple of kilometers of the client, we start using a different set of sensors and doing relative navigation. And for that, we had 3 sensors on board, 3 different phenomenologies. We used a visible sensor, infrared sensor, and something called a LiDAR, which is kind of like a laser rangefinder that scans an image using this laser rangefinder. And so those imagers were what we used to do the navigation from waypoint to waypoint. So the satellite would autonomously maneuver from one waypoint to the next waypoint, and then the ground would get involved to give it permission to move on to the next waypoint after that. So that's really the key fundamental capability that enabled us to do that very close operations approach to the client satellite.
And just building on that, another question here asks to what extent the docking was autonomous, and how cooperative was Intelsat 901. I'm assuming it was stabilized. Was there any sharing of sort of TT&C?
Right, right. So Intelsat was very cooperative. As a company, they were super cooperative. The satellite we were docking to was not prepared. So just to use a little bit of the lexicon from Converse that we developed to really clarify things there, when we talk about the satellite prepared for docking, does it have, design docking interfaces? And that satellite was designed in the 1990s. It was not foreseen to ever be touched again after it was launched. So it was not prepared at all for this docking. So that's one piece. The other part of the question was around autonomy. As I mentioned in the previous answer, we use waypoints along the way, and the satellite would autonomously go from waypoint to waypoint. So you saw in the video there, we go from far hold to near hold to capture box at different waypoints. At the capture box, it would stop and it would wait there until we gave the final command to dock. And all of the steps to do the docking then from that point forward were automated. The probe going into the liquid Apogee engine, retracting, clamping the two together, and then recovering the attitude of the combined stack was all autonomous.
So shifting a bit to the sort of the business case, a question here about how do you see the financial sustainability or the long-term forecast for this business? And is there a difference between what the LEO case might be and the GEO case?
Well, we particularly went after the GEO here initially, at least, because that is where we see the market, right? That's where there's a vast majority of commercial operators are there. There are also a lot of government satellites that operate out in those markets. There's also a physics reason for choosing the GEO orbit, and that is because most of those satellites are all pretty much in the same orbital plane, right? Some of them are inclined a little bit, but you don't have the huge differences of inclination that you have in the low Earth orbits. So we have 400 plus satellites in one orbit plane that makes it very efficient for our MEV or our robotic vehicle to move around from one satellite to the next. So that really isn't an enabler from a basic physics perspective. It doesn't use much fuel for us to do that, to go from one to the next. Whereas in the low Earth orbits, it's much more difficult until, in the future here, there's a lot of new systems that are going up that could create orbit planes in the LEO and MEO orbits that have a lot of satellites in an individual orbit plane. At that point, then for us, we think it will then make much more sense to go to low Earth orbit. There may be other special cases that have high value targets that would be, willing to spend that money to do a servicing mission for those particular assets. And so everything we're developing here would translate directly to that mission as well.
So we got about a minute and a half left here. We got one other question. It's currently the highest voted up there. And it's about a future regulatory framework. You talked a bit about sort of the national licensing of these activities. The question is, what sort of law framework do you think we need to be able to collect non-working space satellites, other kinds of space debris, for some sort of a recycling operation, or be able to reuse those resources?
Wow, that's a difficult question. An international framework.
It is. It's very challenging.
I wish I had the answer to that one. It is very challenging because sometimes finding ownership of some of the debris can be challenging. But I think the idea of recycling is an excellent concept, and I think it is on the roadmap for the future. So our robotic vehicle, for example, is just starting to get into the concept of in-orbit assembly and basic repairs. The next step after that, I can very well see us potentially harvesting good equipment like antennas off of satellites that might be in the graveyard orbit, and using those antennas to support the development of new spacecraft in orbit that are assembled, manufactured in orbit, or potentially having stations that can bring in orbital debris and recall the materials from those. Of course, the regulatory framework there, having permission of the original owner in the state that licensed that is really critical to that. And that's where we need to find a way to have all these different nations work together to achieve that cohesive regulatory framework.
Yeah, absolutely. It revolves around first, identify who owns that piece of object or that debris, and then getting permission. That's really to be considered. Well, thank you very much for this, Joe. It's been a very enlightening discussion. Thank you to all the audience for putting good questions, and back to the rest of the IF program.
Thank you, Brian. I've really enjoyed sharing our story, and I encourage anyone with further questions to visit us at Northrop Grumman's virtual booth. Thanks. Have a great day.